All right, so I'm Paul Schulman, the CEO, as it says there. This is Konstantin Girkhovskiy, who's our CTO. We're co-founders of Acuity Systems. We've been around since for about 13 or so years. Started in the telecommunications industry and with billing systems, object processing systems, things like that, large integration and software development. And over the course of the last 5 to 7 years, I'd say, been involved in the content management, information management, analytics kind of space. So we're here to talk to you about open source in the government. I'm going to kind of do a fluffy little open, so to speak, and close, and Konstantin will dive a little deeper into some of the more of the open source details. So, one of the things I decided to do was talk to some of our customer base, and kind of get a pulse on what keeps them up at night. As a gentleman in the main room said, he wants his pillow to be soft at night. Took me a while to figure out what that means. But, what keeps you up? What are your concerns? What is going on that's making your job sort of difficult, or, that are obstacles that you're seeing? And really, kind of, if you had to summarize everything I heard into one kind of catchy little phrase, it was basically that speed is the new currency. And what I mean by that is that the now experience wins. So basically, people have said that, because of the technology available today, we're spoiled by how quickly we can get information and what the access to that information looks like. I'm old, so if you imagine 20, 30 years ago, now I can, if I need a USB cable for this presentation, this morning I could Amazon it and probably have a drone drop it, into my hand in about 2 hours, and I've got my cable. So, you have to compete with that now. That's an expectation, because on our phones we have hundreds of applications that give us this access to information, and it's just right there. Now, on the other hand, later loses, right? So there's consequences to not responding. So, this just gives you a few examples of entities that maybe kind of missed the boat. So I think this is interesting. It doesn't really work too well on a Linux machine, but so here's a gentleman who was a former Kodak executive who said, a business consulting staff that they hired basically said, there's really no rush to move to digital. Let's make our 70 cents on the buck, and we'll worry about the nickel, on the dollar for digital later. So there's kind of a cost that was associated with that. When we hear about what makes a now experience positive, right, or what people are looking for, again, it's on demand. It's this instant access to data. You're really, in a lot of cases, taking out the middleman and just have access directly to source data, and it's giving you the information. And also, people are looking for an intuitive experience, right? We're conditioned to, I ought to be able to open something up and figure out how to work it. I really shouldn't have to go to a week of training to figure out how to use this application that's serving my constituents or my consumers or my internal staff. It should be intuitive. And lastly, it should provide personalization. So I shouldn't have to go through needless menus or data or information that's really not applicable to me. I ought to be able to sign on and get information that's relevant to me, or what my job is, or what tasks that I need to accomplish. And this kind of shift in thinking is having an impact. Our slides are totally messed up. I'm sorry. There's supposed to be color in there. But anyway, this shift is impacting really every industry that you can think of. But seeing as though we're here at a public sector summit, let's talk about the government for a while, and I'm going to turn it over to my smarter friend who will discuss the open source technologies. Do you want to flip it?
Yeah, probably need it. Everybody can hear me. Small room.
Why don't you stand up?
I don't want to stand up. Okay. Basically, what our approach was...
Hold the mic closer to your...
Our approach was, why shouldn't government be a winner too? Like, we were on a conference a few weeks ago, and we were talking also about, is government agencies, are they in any competition or not? And majority of people are saying, no, government agencies don't have a competition. And we disagree with them, because government agencies always compete for budget, always compete to be able to basically bring their agenda up front. And they need to be able to be on the winning side of this game. Especially, how to make it easier for them and how to make it more advanceable for them to get there. And what we actually realized, which started to advance before we engaged with government, that government is looking at these winning patterns too. And we believe that deploying open source, not only as an open source product or pieces of code coming from open source, but overall open source practice and culture helps government to be a winner. It's not the only way to go, but probably a very important way for government to go. And in 2009 and 2013, government, especially like OMB and White House, they enacted a few memorandums. The first one was about open government. And later the one came about open data policy. And if you look at these items that you can read about, transparency, participatory, collaborative, all these items, you recognize they are principles for open source solutions and open source development. And we realized that too, and it was sort of our desire to help government in some of these areas. That's why it was actually our first project that we moved in, which was closely tied to open source. And if you look today, and I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with this project, which is called open data policies or open government, but you can find that today there are multiple projects under these initiatives, like open data governance, metadata schema, and I will touch some of them. Government also developed some communities that can benefit from this open source approach, but also contribute a lot. And you probably can see some of them in your daily basis. If you are working with government, government is working on different standardized APIs. And this is one of these communities built under Open Government and Open Data Initiative. Important part is definitely open license ability to use whatever is developed within these communities by other agencies or by public if it's legally applicable. And one thing I want to also to drive your attention to is what is called public domain dedications. Many people don't know sometimes how to search for publicly available data in a government area, and especially for open license. That's why when you search for open license, you may not always find what you're looking for, because in the government area it's called public domain dedications. An important part is to have openly discuss and find a consensus on standards. Because each agency today, and not even agency, like department and within agency, and within each department, you will find out a lot of siloed data. And many people believe, oh, my way of getting this data out, or my way of creating an APIs is the right way. The reality is that the only way we can become collaborative and get value from the data is if we have consensus of how we are managing data, what is data lineage, how we access data. And just to give you an idea what is going on today with this open data project. First of all, because it's open source by its nature and definition, it was very logical to use available open source tools such as GitHub, Tcam, OpenSearch, Node, and some of them are pretty sort of maybe look like an older type of projects, because we started these projects 5-6 years ago, whatever was available. Interestingly enough, we immediately recognized with the government that there is a huge necessity of shared services that needs to be created and accessible as a repository. There are these projects called labs.data.gov. I would recommend you to take a look at them. And code.gov today contains more than 1,000 projects. that may be, again, useful for different agencies and actually help also agencies not just not to reinvent the wheel, but also to be compliant with OMB and White House initiatives. Now we're getting to General Services Administration, which was our first project related to governance, data governance at federal agencies. And I also apologize, unfortunately it's difficult for you guys to read it. But what was important for us as GSA? We also wanted to structure this project as we started as open source like project, not just use open source code, but also set it up so that agencies within GSA or agencies outside of GSA can collaborate and get to a better result. And our goal was actually to develop a platform which is called today D2D, which is data to decision platforms that will allow to break some of these barriers and to put siloed data together and to be able to provide government and public with more accessible and more useful data. Because data today is treated as a national resource. And only value it will present, we will treat this data that government own and operate as an asset. And in order for us to do it, we needed to go, okay, sorry guys for these slides, but basically we need to go deeper and understanding what really represents data as an asset, especially something that we want to collaborate and want to make available to other folks. First of all, it has to be public. And when we're talking being public, it means as permitted by law, but as much data as possible should be released to public. And here is the main reason why. Because you all work with different government agencies, and you know basically what is the accuracy today of the government data, and how accurate is the data, which is a foundation of decision making. I think anybody can have an idea based on your experience. Okay, I will try to basically to say something that probably people don't want to say. It's well less before 50%. You know, there are only few probably agencies that achieve 50% of accuracy in their data. And now this data is used to make crucial decisions. It's not a good idea. And one of the reasons why it's happening is because there are not much people that are looking at the data, not many people that are looking at the data, not many people that are running different models against it, because it was like all siloed data and not available. If you look in open source, one of the reasons why open source code has a high quality because many developers are using it. Many developers are running through the code to make sure that, yes, it makes sense. Whatever they're going to use, they want to make sure that it's a quality code. We have the same approach. We need to make sure that our data is public. It has to be accessible. Accessible means you should be able to download it in the formats that you can use. You know, it should not be just some garbage or gibberish coming in the file and you have no idea what it is. You have to be able to use this data. The next item, it has to be described. Would you start any project if you have no idea what it is? Or if I give you a piece of code, would you think this code is good unless you understand what it does, why it does so, how it communicates with other pieces of code? Probably not. Same applies to data. Unless data provided to you has a clear definition for each field, for where it's coming from, what it does, how we arrived there, it has no value to you. And that also comes to completeness of the data, because all the data lineage people need to understand, developers need to understand, analysts need to understand in order to make sense out of it. And it has to be reusable. We have to be able, whatever is produced as a piece of data, it has to be able to have an open license to reuse, that other people can say, okay, I just got this data from data.gov. Can I share it with somebody else? Can I send it to somebody else? And because of that, any data which is under this open data initiative is absolutely reusable. Important part is also timely. You need to make sure that same as an open source code, is delivered timely when there is a demand. The data is delivered timely. To update your data once a year or once in a quarter is not enough. You really need to get this data and provide data to public and to other agencies as soon as basically the demand is there. An important part is basically manage it. Manage it after it is released. If you're using any software today, you always want to have community and community manager in open source that can help you answer some questions or navigate to you to the right place or where you can post your questions. The same applies to government data. If we release today government data with no management post-release, it has no value. You should always be able to clarify what it is, get information, or not even like clarify what it is and get information, but also contribute to what you've done with the data where you achieve a better results. And that's why when we started this project, we realized, first of all, we need to use open source software, which was easy for us at GSA because GSA enacted open source first initiative. Anytime we're bringing a new software to any GSA projects, we have to make sure that there is no sort of like, and I'm sorry, when we bring any CATS product to GSA, we have to make sure that there is no open source that does the same thing. And only in case there is absolutely no way to get sort of open source with a similar functionality, we are allowed to bring CATS products. And at the same time, we realize we have to build a community. We have to help to build the whole community within GSAs that will collaborate, that will be able to share their data, that will be able to share their analytical models, and do it in a proper legal way. That's why what we did there, first of all, we decided to assess what projects, open source projects at the time, were available but would have sense for us to bring on board. We put a few criteria, I just named some of them. First of all, we wanted to make sure that the projects have a pretty sizable community, which means we don't want to bring something to the government which is brand new and not necessarily gained any popularity. We also wanted to understand how mature this project is before we bring it to government. API standard, it was very important to us. Open API standard. If some open source project is going with some, I would say, proprietary or only used by this project APIs, we probably don't want to use it. And comprehensive roadmap. What we are also looking at open source communities, do they have features that they're planning to build? How does the discussion go about these features? Who is managing these discussions? What the contributions are? And it tells us, can we rely on this open source project going forward, or it will disappear, as we know many open source projects disappeared and never came back. At the same time, as I mentioned, we built a community. We built data stewardship communities. We built data scientist communities, technical forums to allow broader engagement of users of the data within the government and outside of the government. Because in order for us to build our roadmap, how we want to develop this data to decision platform, which is we need to understand better demand. And nothing will help us to understand demand better, the collaboration with these communities. Important part also for us to educate data scientists, educate data stewards. They used to live in their silent environment, were very, very attached to their data. They didn't want to release any information about their data, and they didn't necessarily see the value of this collaboration and cooperation. And that's why probably last couple of years, at least like 50% of our resources were really focused on education, bringing our communities up to speed, making them feel that they contribute, that we listen to them, and we build all our features and our future roadmap based on their concern and their needs. And these communities, they're not only within GSA. We hear from other government agencies, since information is provided to these other government agencies, and we also hear from public because all the information that possible is publicly available, otherwise it's available between these different agencies. And this is just like a list, and I'm sorry, you probably cannot see it well, but this is a list of open source projects that we utilized up till now. And this is not a full list, it's not like a static list. As our roadmap demands expansion and new projects coming to place, we always consider new projects, and that's why our technical forum is pretty active. And we also always have a lot of discussion and collaboration and ideas like who gonna research what solution, and it helps us to move forward a lot faster than otherwise we would move. Now, and coming back to what Paul was saying about basically now experience. How open source help our D2D project at GSA to gain now experience? First of all, as I mentioned, is development of community, because development of these communities allow us to define our roadmap and the features that are needed. And we also, because of that, we also get a lot of our government users to be a beta testers or people that are willing to do like an extra to get what they need. Faster and easier acquisition process. We don't really need, when it's an open source, we can always download community version and go with some proof of concepts before we will entertain discussion of buying licenses or buying support for it. And if something does not work, it doesn't work. We move next without actually going through all the hoops of the acquisition process. Quick deployments. What we also learned, and you probably all know as well, that when it comes to CATS products, it's not always easy to deploy CATS product fast. Because when you run into any issue while trying to deploy CATS products, the only usually way for you to solve this issue is to go back to this organization, this development company, support or professional services. When you are using open source, there are a lot of communities available. Open source, usually people who run these communities, they're impatient. They really want things to be up and running fast. And our experience was that when we need to put something like up and running, we can do it within an hours, not like weeks or months like it may be otherwise. Besides that, it's also like, as I mentioned before, it's a higher quality. When it comes to quality of these software products, actually, our experience was that when we deploy open source, usually it's a much higher quality, and our ability to deploy faster and get through quality assurance, get through security scans much faster compared to many CATS products that exist on the market today. Ease of customization. This is very important for us, especially when it comes to security. In order for us to pass through ATO process, authority to operate, in order to fulfill system security plan and make security folks happy, we have to close a lot of gaps that otherwise, unless it's open source, we would not be really able to close and figure out how to do deployment for a specific agency. And important part is evolutionary delivery. When you educate your users that you're working with on a daily basis, that these features that they expect you to see, they can affect, they can vote. You know, if the feature gets more votes, it probably will be implemented faster. You have a better support, and they understand this evolutionary approach when we're saying, guys, when we're telling you, you will see this feature, and you will see the features that the whole community vote for, they know that, yes, they will get it. And sometimes they're coming back to us saying, we found a project that potentially can fulfill our needs. Can we deploy it? We definitely will allow them to play with it. We'll allow them to basically do their prototyping. And if this prototyping is good, we can deploy it and add it to our platform. Which brings us to important part of what our users really want today. Many of them, they want to affect where the project goes, how fast they're going to see these features. They want to see these features now. And one important part of that now is self-service. Because what we also do by employing open source, we allow self-service, especially on a proof of concept and prototyping layer. I believe I'm on my time. Any questions?
So how's the federal government, so there's sort of open source, and then there's open source support models, so you know, groups like Confluent and Red Hat take what sort of community, like community features, and then they sort of layer in their own version of that. I'm just wondering how that distinction is played out in your opinion of that.
So what I would say, potentially to clarify that, is, a benefit of open source, which Konstantin was alluding to, is that oftentimes there's a community version, and before the agency or the decision makers or stakeholders have to make a decision, a go or no go, based on a demo you've done or a POC, they could download something, or that you can work with them, and they can do their own little POC or research, and then when it sort of passes scrutiny, then they can go and get the licensed version. I mean, basically, I think a lot in the DoD and the IC community, you've got a lot of community stuff, open source technologies being deployed that nobody's getting paid for except the contractors doing the work. So there's a lot of hidden, let's say, information. But I mean, for the most part, everybody, in this whole GSA project, which was founded on the concept of, what's a big problem that everybody is suffering from is siloed data, right? I mean, that's been 10 years or more old, a problem being able to get to the data or share data, collaborate, et cetera. So that's what the GSA wanted to do. They wanted to get rid of the silos. They wanted to create an open collaborative framework that they'd be able to accept any kind of data sources and then put it in, a logical data framework that, is federated and curated, and so then it really doesn't matter where it's coming from, and the user can't see where it's coming from. Essentially, it's just access to the data, single sign-on, and and security policies and governance, and enable it or make it so that the data that that person's supposed to be able to see sees that data. So I don't know if that was a long way of getting around.
To also tell on what Paul said, it's much easier to get support money, especially if it's not capital expenditure money, but rather it's O&M money, to support already proven model. We can start with community version, and community version works, and we have enough users. We can always go back to the leadership and say, now in order for us to scale, instead of scaling internal team, it's probably much more beneficial to buy support from organizations such as Red Hat. So in this case scenario, we can scale fast while keeping the support on the enterprise level as we need to keep it. And from a budgetary perspective, it goes under basically operation maintenance rather than under capital expenditure.
Have you guys had issues with trust of data? So you imagine you did talk about separating sort of the data that you produce from the source, which I imagine you're trying to protect sort of where things come from, but sometimes that leads to a lack of trust as well. Have you guys experienced anything like that, or are there ways that you've had to bolster the trust in the data that you're providing?
Our data today actually goes through multiple communities, and we've been multiple times in a situation when some of these groups, what we call it domain users, which are specifically working with some specific business domains, they were coming back and saying, guys, this data doesn't make sense. Now, as we understand it, now we try to plug it into a different model, it doesn't make sense. It usually goes back to the source, and because all of them are within the same community, it's quicker for them to solve the issue. I agree with you, the trust issue was there, but now it's getting less and less of the trust.
But one thing is, I mean, for the most part, for the architecture of the framework, those kind of considerations were built in, both sort of culturally, so to speak, from a business process standpoint, and programmatically, via code with governance and security protections, et cetera. In a lot of cases, it's the GSA. The GSA provides, data and information to many other, OMB, many other government outlets, et cetera. So to some extent, you have to, they already have access to a lot of that data. Anything else? You're our one good questioner. Anyone else have a question?
Do you guys have multiple layers of trust? Like, so just having run through like big, data integration. But the problem is that there are some facts about, like, say, a record that I know for certain are 100% true, and then you sort of layer on and you have more. You gather more data sources, you get more information, and sometimes the overall aggregate quality is, you start to trust some things less than others, and I'm just wondering if you come across that, and how do you deal with that? Because that's something you can control when you present to users. You can only say, there are some organizations like the FBI that just throw away a lot of their data and say, hey, we can't trust it, it's not at a certain level, you only get this data. I'm just wondering if you had experience with
Yeah, it's interesting. Yes, we do. And actually, we were even thinking about defining some blockchain behind the data, which we're working on right now, to make sure that from the source to the final aggregate level, the data is clear and everybody see and understand where it's coming from. And when I was talking about completeness of the data, which is one of important part of our data management and open data overall, this is right now it's a big sort of issue where we are paying attention and we're looking how to improve it. But yes, overall, from the source, from initial source, whatever is this records coming from, up to the aggregate level, we have the full transparency of the path.
So very good. So thank you very much. Appreciate your participation.